Welcome, brave listeners, to another frightening tale, presented by yours truly, Wilhelm. Tune in each week where I entertain my listeners with another dark tale of the paranormal, donated by authors from around the world. If you're an author of some paranormal fiction and would like to share a story with my listeners, submit one at frighteningtales.com. And while you're there, tune in for more than 30 hours of previous content. Today's episode is a Frightening Tales exclusive. Like any of the stories I write, you can only find them here on frighteningtales.com. When I write, I like to take the most mundane things around us and reveal the potential horror lurking behind it. And I do that today in a tale I call Unknown Caller. Frank's footsteps echoed in the dimly lit corridor as he trudged wearily down the hallway of his apartment building. Another day at the office had drained him, leaving his mind foggy and his body heavy with exhaustion. The fluorescent lights above flickered intermittently, casting unsettling shadows that danced along the walls. He fumbled with his keys, his fingers clumsy with fatigue, before finally unlocking the door to his apartment. Stepping inside, he was greeted by the familiar scent of stale air and loneliness. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, a worn-out couch, a cluttered coffee table, and a kitchenette tucked into the corner. Frank kicked off his shoes and dropped his briefcase on the floor with a sigh. The day's stress clung to him like a second skin, refusing to let go even in the comfort of his own home. He shuffled into the kitchen and mechanically prepared a microwave dinner, the hum of the appliance a dull background noise to his thoughts. As he ate, an uneasy feeling settled over him, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck that made him glance nervously over his shoulder. The apartment seemed different tonight, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The shadows appeared deeper, more sinister, as if they held secrets just beyond his grasp. After dinner, Frank collapsed on the couch, his eyelids heavy with sleep. He had no energy to do anything else. No hobbies, no friends to call, just the monotonous routine of work and solitude. The television droned in the background, its voices blending into a meaningless buzz. Hours passed in a blur. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second dragging like a weight around Frank's neck. Eventually, exhaustion overcame him and he drifted into a fitful sleep. Sometime in the dead of night, Frank stirred, jolted awake by a sense of unease that gripped his chest like a vice. His eyes snapped open, searching the darkness of his apartment with a growing sense of dread. The television had long since powered down, leaving the room cloaked in oppressive silence. And then he saw it. A movement in the corner of his room, where shadows gathered like tendrils reaching out to him. Frank's heart pounded in his ears as he stared, wide-eyed and paralyzed with fear. The shadows coalesced, twisting and contorting until they formed a figure, a tall, looming shape silhouetted against the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the blinds. The figure stood by the door, its presence suffocating in the stillness of the night. Frank's breath caught in his throat as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. It had no discernible features, just an outline of darkness that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. "Who are you?" Frank managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure remained silent, unmoving, but Frank could feel its gaze upon him, heavy and cold as it bore into his soul. Panic seized him, adrenaline coursing through his veins as fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. With trembling hands, Frank reached for the lamp beside him, fingers fumbling over the switch. He hesitated for a split second, dread knotting in his stomach, before finally flicking it on. In an instant, the room flooded with light, banishing the shadows and revealing nothing. The corner where the figure had stood was now empty, as if it had never been there at all. Frank's pulse thundered in his ears, his chest heaving with exertion and fear. Had it been a trick of the light? A hallucination born from exhaustion and stress? Or was there something lurking in the darkness of his apartment, waiting for him to let his guard down once more? Shaken to the core, Frank remained rooted to the spot, his gaze darting nervously around the room. Every shadow seemed to whisper secrets, every creak of the floorboards a harbinger of unseen menace. He had never believed in ghosts or supernatural entities, but tonight had shattered his convictions. As minutes stretched into eternity, Frank finally forced himself to move. He crossed the room in quick strides, checking the locks on his doors and the windows with a newfound urgency. The apartment felt like a fortress now, walls closing in around him in a suffocating embrace. But even as he tried to reassure himself, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. What had he seen, and would it come back? Lurking in the shadows until he was defenseless once more. With a heavy sigh, Frank retreated to his bedroom, leaving the lights on as a feeble barrier against the unknown. Sleep eluded him for the rest of the night, his mind racing with unanswered questions and the lingering presence of the figure that had invaded his home. Outside, the city slept on, oblivious to the silent terror that had taken root in Frank's apartment. And as dawn broke over the horizon, casting pale light through the windows, Frank knew with a chilling certainty that he was no longer alone, that something had come to haunt him, lurking just beyond the edge of perception, waiting for its next chance to strike. Ellie woke to the gentle warmth of sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains, casting a soft glow over her new bedroom. She stretched languidly, relishing the comfort of her own bed in her new home, a charming Victorian house nestled in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Portland. Moving here had been a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the hustle and bustle of city life for something quieter, more peaceful. The previous night had been her first in the new house, and despite the unfamiliar surroundings, Ellie had slept surprisingly well. She rose with a sense of purpose, eager to unpack and make the house truly hers. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lured her downstairs to the cozy kitchen, where boxes still lined the walls, waiting to be emptied. As she sipped her coffee, Ellie's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, a faint vibration that pulled her attention away from the task at hand. Glancing at the screen, she frowned at the sight of an unknown number flashing back at her. It was the fourth call since she'd woken up, and it was only mid-morning. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. The number was unfamiliar, and she hadn't given her new number to anyone except her parents. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach as she dismissed the call, ignoring the persistent buzz that followed. Throughout the day, the calls continued. 5 so far. Each time, Ellie's unease grew, compounded by the fact that no messages were left behind. It was as if the caller wanted her to pick up, to acknowledge their presence without revealing their intentions. Ellie busied herself with unpacking, trying to push aside the nagging sense of intrusion that lingered in the back of her mind. The house felt different now, less welcoming, more like a stranger's domain. Shadows seemed to linger in the corners, and every creak of the floorboards made her jump. By late afternoon, Ellie found herself standing by the window, gazing out at the quiet street bathed in the golden light of sunset. The phone rang again, breaking the stillness of the moment. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She let it ring, her heart pounding in her chest. Why won't they leave a message? She muttered to herself, trying to shake off the unease that threatened to overwhelm her. She paced the living room, the weight of the unfamiliar number pressing down on her thoughts. As twilight descended, Ellie retreated to her bedroom, hoping to find solace in the familiarity of her bed. But sleep eluded her, her mind racing with unanswered questions and the persistent buzz of her phone beside her. She tossed and turned, the hours slipping away until the clock showed midnight. And then, just as she began to drift into a restless doze, the phone rang again. Ellie's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening with a mixture of fear and frustration. She stared at the screen, and the unknown number taunted her in the darkness of her room. "Who are you?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. She couldn't bring herself to answer, couldn't risk inviting whatever darkness lurked on the other end of the line into her new life. The phone rang once more, and then silence descended like a shroud over the room. Ellie held her breath, straining to hear any sound that might betray the caller's presence. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the night and the faint hum of the city outside. Hours passed in agonizing slowness as Ellie lay awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, every shadow playing tricks on her tired mind. She had never been superstitious, had never believed in ghosts or things that go bump in the night. But now, in the solitude of her new home, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that unseen eyes were waiting for her to drop her guard. Dawn broke over the horizon, casting pale light through the window. Ellie sat up, exhaustion weighing heavy on her shoulders. The night had been long and restless, leaving her nerves frayed and her thoughts scattered. With a sigh, she reached for her phone, half expecting to see another missed call or a message that would explain everything. But the screen was blank, devoid of any new notifications. The unknown number staring back at her, a silent reminder of the unanswered calls that had haunted her day. Shivering, Ellie wrapped herself in a blanket and ventured downstairs. The house felt colder now, its walls closing in around her in a suffocating embrace. She needed fresh air, needed to clear her head and shake off the lingering sense of dread that clung to her like a second skin. Outside, the morning was crisp and clear, the neighborhood quiet and still. Ellie wandered aimlessly down the street, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She couldn't stay in the house, couldn't bear another moment trapped within its walls with the unknown caller lurking just beyond reach. And as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that her new home held secrets. Secrets that whispered in the shadows and lingered in the corners, waiting for her to uncover their dark truths. Frank sat in the corner of his dimly lit room, his back pressed against the cool plaster wall. The phone lay in his lap, its screen displaying the number he had dialed, random digits chosen hastily at the start of this nightmare. He had dialed it once, hoping against hope that no one would answer. Now he had to repeat the process over and over, each call a gamble with his life. The dark figure loomed in the corner, its presence oppressive and suffocating. Frank could feel its eyes on him, an unseen force that bore into his very soul. It had given him a simple task: to dial the number 13 times. If no one answered, he would live. But if someone picked up, his life would end. He glanced at the clock on the wall. Hours had passed since he made the last call. The figure said nothing, only watching with a patience that unnerved Frank to his core. Time was both his ally and his enemy. Each passing minute brought him closer to safety, yet it also meant another opportunity for someone to answer the phone. With a trembling hand, Frank lifted the phone and dialed the number again. His fingers faltered over the keypad, the digits blurring before his eyes. He pressed call and held his breath, praying for silence on the other end. The phone rang, a solitary sound that echoed in the silence of the room. Frank counted each ring, his heart pounding in his chest with every passing second. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. The figure in the corner remained motionless, his form barely discernible in the shadows. Frank dared not look directly at it, afraid of what he might see if he met its gaze. 4 rings, 5 rings, 6 rings. Frank's pulse quickened. He could feel sweat trickling down his brow, his entire body tense with anticipation. The phone continued to ring. Each second stretched into an eternity. 7 rings, 8 rings. Hope flickered in Frank's chest, a fragile flame that threatened to extinguish with the next ring. He prayed silently, willing the caller to lose interest, to ignore it, and leave him in peace. 9 rings, 10 rings. And then, just as relief began to wash over him, a voice answered, a sharp intake of breath that pierced the silence like a knife. Frank's blood turned to ice as he realized his mistake, his hand shaking violently as he fumbled to end the call. "Hello? This is Ellie's phone. I'm not here right now, but you can leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as I can." Fear gripped Frank's heart like a vice. He had come so close, had almost made it through the night without sealing his own fate, but now with each call he was gambling with his life. His chances dwindled with every unanswered ring. That had felt far too close, but he wasn't finished. He had more calls to make. He took a deep breath and dialed the number again, his hand trembling uncontrollably. The phone rang, a haunting melody that echoed in the confines of the room, a stark reminder of the peril he faced. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings, Frank closed his eyes, willing the phone to remain unanswered, willing the caller to not be anywhere near the phone, and spare him from the horror that awaited if someone picked up. 4 rings, 5 rings, 6 rings. His heart pounded in his ears, drowning out all other sounds. The figure in the corner ever vigilant, just staring and watching him, its presence filling the room with an oppressive weight. 7 rings. 8 rings. A flicker of hope ignited within Frank's chest. Maybe this time, he thought desperately. Maybe this time. 9 rings. 10 rings. And then just as before, a voice answered, a soft murmur that sent a chill down Frank's spine. Panic surged through him, adrenaline flooding his veins as he hurriedly disconnected the call, his hand shaking so violently that the phone slipped from the grasp and clattered to the floor. Every time the voicemail picked up, Frank felt like his heart would explode. He was in the home stretch. Only a few calls left. Dread settled over Frank like a shroud. Not many calls left, just a few more. Just a few more chances to cheat death, to defy the shadowy figure that held him captive in his own home. He had to focus, had to remain vigilant. Each call had to be timed perfectly, spaced out to maximize the chances of no one answering. With trembling hands, Frank picked up the phone once more, his fingers hovering over the keypad. He closed his eyes, blocking out the finger in the corner and the fear that threatened to consume it. He held his breath and dialed the number again, his movements slow and deliberate. The phone rang, a solitary sound that reverberated in the stillness of the room. Again, Frank counted each ring, his heart in his throat, as he prayed for silence on the other end. 1 ring. 2 rings. Sunday dawned bright and promising for Ellie. The previous day had been a whirlwind of unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, and she was determined to turn her new house into a cozy home. As she sipped her morning coffee, the events of the past weekend weighed heavily on her mind and filled her with anxiety. The calls, 7 in total, had rattled her. Each time her phone buzzed with that unknown number, she hesitated, torn between curiosity and fear. Irrational as it was, she knew that it was just a phone call. Why was she to worry? But she couldn't help herself. There was an unease about these calls that she couldn't put her finger on. What if it was someone in need of help? What if it was a long-lost friend trying to reconnect? Ellie tried to rationalize the calls to make them seem less threatening than they felt. Maybe it was a wrong number, she thought, or a telemarketer with a persistent streak. But deep down, a nagging sense of unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more sinister at play. Something lurking beneath the surface of her ordinary life. As she continued to unpack and organize throughout the day, Ellie's thoughts kept drifting back to the unanswered calls. What if they continued? What if they escalated? She glanced at her phone periodically, half expecting it to light up with that dreaded unknown number once more. By late afternoon, Ellie managed to distract herself with the mundane tasks of setting up her kitchen and arranging books on shelves. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows through the windows of her new home. She felt a twinge of satisfaction as she surveyed her progress. The house was beginning to feel like hers, a sanctuary from the uncertainties that lurked outside. Evening settled over the neighborhood, bringing with it a quiet stillness that enveloped Ellie's home. She prepared a simple dinner and ate alone at the kitchen table, the ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound in the otherwise silent house. As the hours passed and darkness blanketed the sky, Ellie found herself drawn to the comfort of her bed. She climbed under the covers, exhaustion weighing heavy on her eyelids. Despite her unease, sleep claimed her swiftly, wrapping her in its embrace. In the depths of the night, Ellie stirred, a faint ringing pulling her from her dreams. Groggy and disoriented, she reached for the phone on the nightstand, the screen illuminated with the same unknown number, taunting her in the dim light of her bedroom. 5 missed calls glowed back at her in the darkness. Her heart skipped a beat. Should she answer? Should she ignore it like before? The unanswered questions of the persistent worry gnawed at her resolve. What if it was important this time? What if someone really needed her help? With shaky breath, Ellie swiped to answer. Hello? Her voice was hesitant, tinged with apprehension. Silence greeted her, a heavy, oppressive silence that hung in the air like a veil. Ellie strained to hear any sound on the other end, her pulse quickening with each passing second, and then dial tone. Before she could utter another word, the line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on Ellie from all sides. She held the phone to her ear, her breath catching in her throat, but there was nothing, not even static, to break the stillness of the night. Heart pounding, Ellie set the phone down slowly, her hands trembling. She was alone in her room, surrounded by darkness and the weight of unanswered questions. Should she call the police? 1,000 scenarios played out in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. But as the night wore on, no more calls came. The house remained quiet, save for the occasional creak of settling wood and the rustling of leaves outside her window. Ellie eventually drifted back to sleep, exhaustion claiming her once more. Days passed, in a blur of cautious normalcy. Ellie went about her routines, work during the day, evenings spent exploring her new neighborhood, or reading in the quiet of her living room. The unanswered calls faded into the background, a distant memory overshadowed by the demands of everyday life. Her house began to feel more like a home with each passing day. Boxes were unpacked, pictures hung on the walls, and the once empty rooms filled with warmth and familiarity. Ellie allowed herself to relax, to believe that perhaps the ordeal was over, that whatever had plagued her those first days in the new home had moved on. One night, as Ellie lay in bed, the shadows in the corner of her room seemed to grow darker still. A chill swept through the air, raising goosebumps on her skin. She sat up slowly, her heart beating in her chest as a figure stepped into her room. A silhouette against the darkness, its presence palpable and menacing. Moving through the dim light, it came to stand by the door. "What do you want?" Ellie managed to choke out, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound defiant. The figure pointed at Ellie's phone, its eyes gleaming with an otherworldly light. Ellie turned to look at her phone, where a text message appeared, and it read, "You must use your phone to call a random number, one you've never dialed before. You will call this number 13 times. before midnight 2 days from now, or you will die. If anyone answers the call, you will die. If after 13 calls no one picks up, you'll never see me again." Dread settled over Ellie like a suffocating blanket. The rules of the game were clear, the consequences dire. "Why me?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible over the rush of blood in her ears. The figure pointed again at the phone, a gesture devoid of warmth or humanity. A text popped up. "Unknown number," it replied cryptically. With those final words, the figure settled into the shadows that seemed to grow like tendrils that wove themselves into her room, leaving Ellie with her fear and the weight of an impossible task. She held her breath, dialed some numbers, and then counted the rings. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings.
Thank you, brave listeners, for joining me for another dark story. I urge my listeners to go out and find more content by any of our authors, if you're not too timid. If you enjoyed today's episode, please click the like button. And if you don't want to miss a future story, then click the subscribe button. Tune in next week for another frightening tale, if you're brave enough.